The United States of America is turning 250 years old this year. And I'm no spring chicken myself, but I'm here to tell you, as the youngins say these days, 250 years is old AF. I mean, Americans love to talk about how the USA is this young democracy, but most sources I looked at estimate that somewhere between 60 and 80% of nation states were founded in the 20th century. So compared to most of the rest of the world, America is downright geriatric. And one of the worst things about being such an old nation and an old class society at that is that our oligarchy has had a quarter of a millennium to develop and perfect their propaganda strat. And let me tell you, as someone who grew up in the USA, they have that shit locked down. They've pretty much perfected the art of convincing the working class to fight and struggle against our own interests. And one of the cornerstones of the American propaganda model is glazing the ever-living out of the ruling class of capitalists, especially those capitalists who put this whole racket together. I'm talking about the Founding Fathers. Yeah, as a nation, we Americans have daddy issues, and they're only going to get worse as the Epstein files begin to tear away at some of the layers of psychological barriers which the ruling class have planted deep within our psyches and our social consciousness over the past 2.5 centuries. The release of all this dirt on Jeffrey Epstein and his inner circle has resulted in a general elevation of our collective understanding of the ruling class and how these oligarchs operate behind the scenes. And I know that a lot of you watching this right now haven't been surprised at all by the Epstein files. You probably see these files as confirmation of what you already knew, that our society is ruled by ghoulish predators. But you're not like most Americans. You're a non-compete viewer. You're built different. You got that advanced social consciousness. But most Americans out there are surprised and confused by all these revelations. A lot of folks just never thought about it very much, or worse yet, they've genuinely found themselves looking up to capitalists like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and, yeah, Donald Trump as their heroes. After all, in Western society, it's been the norm for a very long time to view millionaires and billionaires who make up the ruling class as our leaders and our role models. And that perception has been intentionally cultivated by the ruling class and by our media going back for centuries. When a billionaire writes a book, it's going to become a bestseller. There's an entire industry of pseudo-journalists and podcasters who garner millions of followers by interviewing wealthy and influential power brokers of the ruling class or by writing glowing puff pieces about them. Terms like grind set tech bros and hustle culture, they might be relatively new to our lexicon, but in the USA, the jet set billionaire playboy type has long been a heroic and romanticized figure. When I was growing up, there was this show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous.
Get ready for another incredible Lifestyles, your VIP journey into the lives and loves of today's winners who really know how to enjoy the great things of life.
It was hosted by Robin Leach, whose distinctive, arrogant, British accented narration became a bit of a pop culture meme, often summoned to appeal to our fascination and admiration of the ruling class.
Welcome to Lifestyles of the Rich and Rotten. Here we take a weekly peek into the incredible world of glitz, glamour, and an announcer who shouts for no apparent reason.
Robin Leach is in the Epstein files, and I can't read out the allegations about him to you in this video because if I do, YouTube will definitely censor it. But the relevant text is here on the screen if you'd like to pause for a moment and read it. I might have to censor the text as well, but you should be able to get the general gist of it. It is not a coincidence that Robin Leach is in the Epstein files, because what we're talking about here is not just some assorted group of depraved individuals. We're talking about an economic class phenomenon, and Robin Leach was an integral part of promoting and propagandizing our ruling economic class of capitalists. And I believe that the Epstein files coming out and us learning about people like Robin Leach is actively elevating our social consciousness by poking at those deep contradictions which we've always held somewhere in our minds, even if we didn't realize it. There are things that all of us know, that we've always known, but that we by and large have refused to fully or properly accept and address as a working class. Our society has long suffered from a sort of mass cognitive dissonance when it comes to well-known historic truths about the ruling class of our capitalist society and the history of our capitalist society. And that's what this video is about. That's what I'm here to talk to you about today. I believe the time has come for us to collectively confront and process these truths on a mass scale. Things are coming to a head, and we're at a crossroads right now, and we can either go back to burying our heads in the sand when it comes to the disgusting nature of the ruling class of our society, or we can come to grips with these truths that have been staring us in the face for all of our lives. I'm hardly the first person to talk about this subject. On the contrary, there have been plenty of folks for generations who've been begging us to pay attention to these matters since long before I was born. But these calls for truth and justice have largely been dismissed and ignored, and that's because they've largely been coming from oppressed groups. I'm talking about poor people, black folks, indigenous folks, the LGBTQ+ community, women, and so on. There's a reason we use the term marginalized to describe such social groups. Folks in these communities have long been relegated to the sidelines of society, ignored by the mass media, and is that they understand how disgusting the ruling class is. They have been at the center of these oppressive systems of class society. They're the ones who have bared witness to it the most directly. And now that the state has been taken over by fascists, there's a concerted effort to bury and erase and destroy these voices from our institutions even more entirely, all in the name of eliminating wokeness. Because what is wokeness if not confronting these truths, waking up to the truth about this disgusting ruling class of capitalists? There's a reason the ruling class wants to wipe out the stories and voices of these marginalized people, and it all has to do with these truths that are being so uncomfortably spotlighted in the Epstein files. There's been a lot of talk in light of the Epstein files of conspiracy theories or government cover-ups or the closely held secrets of Epstein's powerful inner circle of billionaires and politicians and royalty and CEOs. But the truth is, most of this stuff was never really kept secret. The ruling class has been engaging in these kinds of horrible acts pretty much in the open for as long as we've had class society. And on some level, we all know that. It's really undeniable. The facts are all too clear in the historic record, even with all the propaganda and revisionism that's shoved down our throats. If you stop and think about it for a moment, and they don't want us to stop and think about it, the facts are all too clear in the historic record. And that's even with all the propaganda and revisionism that's shoved down our throats since grade school. But we've all been conditioned to collectively compartmentalize the truth about the ruling class, stretching all the way back to the founding fathers, so that most Americans have failed to fully confront the dark truth about our capitalist overlords. In science fiction, there's this concept of a perception filter, which causes you to basically gaslight yourself about reality. In the British sci-fi show Doctor Who, the Doctor hides his spaceship with a perception filter, which causes anyone who looks at it to see a harmless-looking blue police call box. Racist nerd and science fiction writer H.P. Lovecraft wrote more ominous stories about interdimensional beings that were so horrible and impossible for the human mind to process that people who came across them simply couldn't perceive them. With a perception filter, your eyes can see the phenomenon, but your brain classifies it as too stressful to process. It's the mental equivalent of a blind spot.
You might not have even noticed, but your brain did.
Our capitalist society has cultivated a highly advanced perception filter through propaganda, which forces us all to look past some pretty heinous and disgusting truths which have been sitting out in the open all along. And it's my hope that these Epstein files might be able to finally break through that perception filter and allow us to see the light. Throughout the remainder of this video, I'm going to make one simple request, and that is that you try to be aware of any perception filters which activate in your own brain. And for the duration of this one video, try to fight the perception filter. If you find yourself getting angry or alarmed at anything I'm saying, just set those feelings aside and consider what's being said on an objective level, and remind yourself of what we've learned from the Epstein files before you rage quit YouTube or start hammering out an angry comment. But if you are going to rage quit YouTube, make sure you do hammer out an angry comment first. It does help with the algorithm. Okay, so time to rip off the Band-Aid. Let's begin by discussing the uncomfortable truth that the founding fathers were collectively every bit as bad as Jeffrey Epstein, if not worse. We can start with perhaps the most egregious example of Thomas Jefferson, who was a sex trafficker and a pedophile. That's just an incontrovertible truth. Jefferson's systematic exploitation of enslaved children and women and men was a foundational element of his financial survival and domestic life in Monticello. By the 1790s, Jefferson abandoned the idea of freeing those he held in bondage and instead pivoted to a strategy of natural increase, explicitly writing to his overseers that enslaved women who bore a child every 2 years were more profitable than the best men on the farm because the children represented a permanent addition to capital. This commodification of human reproduction turned the bodies of enslaved girls and women into literal factories for the development of Jefferson's wealth. And most notoriously, Jefferson also had a decades-long sexual relationship with a girl named Sally Hemings, his late wife's half-sister, who was legally his property. I cannot begin to describe how disgusted I am by the fact that this girl, Sally Hemings, was gifted to Jefferson by his father-in-law, and she was probably fathered by his father-in-law, which would make Thomas Jefferson's wife this girl's half-sister. And this all started, this sexual exploitation that Jefferson committed on this girl started when she was a child of approximately 14 or 15 years old. Thomas Jefferson sex trafficked this enslaved girl, Sally Hemings, during diplomatic missions to Paris. Hemings was enslaved and a child. She could not possibly have consented. I could say a lot more about what a sick, disgusting, horrible monster Thomas Jefferson was, but it honestly just makes me uncomfortable talking about him. Look up the story if you want to learn more. I encourage you to do so because we should all learn these truths, especially if you're from the USA. But anyway, for now, I'm going to move on to George Washington, who was also a human trafficker who bred and exploited human beings to enrich himself financially. Now, this gets glossed over by most pop history accounts of America's first president because he freed all of his slaves when he died. But if you read the words Washington wrote himself about those human beings that he enslaved, then this stops looking like an act of virtue, freeing his slaves. And it looks a lot more like what it was, which was a PR stunt to enhance his posthumous legacy. Just take a look at this letter, which Washington wrote to his farm manager in 1793. Reading this letter seriously makes me feel sick to my stomach every time. It's every bit as disgusting as anything you'll read in the Epstein files. The letter is basically a set of instructions about how he wants his farm to be run back home in Mount Vernon while he's carrying out his second term as President of the United States. Washington writes, "Do not suffer the enslaved children to be in the kitchen or in the yards unless brought there on business, as besides the bad habit, they too frequently are breaking limbs or twigs from or doing other injury to my shrubs, some of which at a considerable expense have been propagated." To translate this into modern English, Washington is saying here that these little children that he has enslaved should only be allowed to go out in the yard if they're being exploited for labor. Under no circumstances does George Washington want these enslaved children to be allowed to hang out or play in the yard because they might harm his precious shrubs. And he paid a lot of money for those shrubs, I'll have you know. There's something that's just so cold and clinical about these instructions. He talks about these human children like he's writing out a purchase order for office supplies. It's just chilling and inhuman. It's clear that Washington simply does not see these kids as human beings. They are his property. And the only reason they exist in Washington's mind is as a resource to be extracted, an investment, a source of wealth. And American propaganda would have us believe that this is all forgivable because Washington was only following the norms of the society he lived in. We gotta cut George some slack. I mean, slavery was a common practice in his time and place. According to this line of propaganda, we can't judge Washington by our modern standards. We have to put Washington's enslavement of human adults and children in historical context. We're expected to hold these two conflicting beliefs about Washington at once. On the one hand, George Washington was a great man who pushed history forward through his genius and force of will and moral superiority. But on the other hand, Washington was just a man of his times, and he lacked agency to resist the currents of social custom, so we mustn't judge him. This is all bullshit. First of all, plenty of people, including white people, opposed slavery in the 1790s when Washington wrote those horrible words. And I'm not just talking about that half-assed, I'll free my slaves when I die sort of anti-slavery that Washington practiced merely to save his own ass in the history books. I'm saying there was a well-developed, well-articulated, well-organized social movement against slavery, which Washington knew about and struggled against throughout his life. A major reason that Washington and his fellow founding fathers wanted to have revolution against England to begin with is because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. That was one of their explicit goals. You see, the founding fathers were capitalists, and Washington's capital, the property which he owned that was the source of all his wealth and power, consisted primarily of stolen land and enslaved human beings. And Washington believed that his capital was being threatened by the shifting legal landscape of the British Empire, and that was the basis of his revolutionary ideology. The founding fathers were capitalists first. And as capitalists, they were extremely class conscious and protective of their wealth. So much so that in 1772, the institution of slavery took a huge hit on British soil after the Somerset versus Stuart ruling. That judgment determined that a slave owner could not forcibly remove a slave from England to be sold abroad. This ruling sent a shockwave of fear through the ruling class of the American colonies, through the founding fathers, because it signaled that England might soon interfere with their most lucrative property rights. And this was a major reason they turned toward revolution. Washington and his peers rose up against England because they wanted to protect their slave-based economic class interests. And knowing all of this, I can't see Washington's letters as evidence that he was a passive man of the times. I judge him as a man of his times, as a man who knew precisely what he was doing, a man who fought tooth and nail and risked his life to maintain his power and wealth as a slave trader and human trafficker. George Washington was a disciplined agent of the capitalist class. He wasn't just following social norms, he was writing the rules that ensured the survival of a slaveholding oligarchy of capitalists. The horror of George Washington is not that he failed to reflect on the wickedness of the system he was a part of. The horror is that he reflected on the system and he decided that the protection of his shrubs was a more rational pursuit than the dignity of those human children he enslaved. And if the shrub thing doesn't convince you, don't worry, it definitely gets worse in the same letter when he starts getting to the instructions on feeding those humans that he had enslaved. You see, Washington heard tell that one of his overseers, a man named Anthony Whiting, had decided to give the slaves some extra rations when they complained about being hungry. And Washington thought this was far too generous. He wrote, "The quantity was increased by Mr. Whiting so as to amount to profusion. This is an error again on the other side. My wish and desire is that they should have as much as they can eat without waste and no more." I mean, this is just fucking supervillain shit. The man wore the teeth of enslaved human beings in his head. He directly participated with gleeful enthusiasm in the genocide and displacement of the native population. A huge reason he wanted to have a revolution was because he wanted more land to the west, and England was honoring treaties with a lot of the indigenous people, and he didn't want to honor them. He wanted to go steal that land, own it, and get even more wealthy. I mean, he writes about that constantly. He was obsessed with it in his personal correspondence. And don't forget, he bred those human beings that he enslaved. So even if you believe that Washington never sexually assaulted any of the women he enslaved, and I don't believe that, but even if you do, it still doesn't matter. He did sexually exploit those enslaved human beings by carrying out a forced breeding program. If we found out that anything like this was happening in the Epstein files, we would rightfully be outraged. But for some reason, we give Washington a pass just because all this stuff happened a long time ago. And that is bullshit. It's a thought-terminating cliche. We only accept it because the ruling class has had centuries to gaslight us into accepting it, to build perception filters in our minds so that we don't see this atrocity for what it truly is. And that makes us excuse the inexcusable, and it's high time we see the truth. I could go on about the other founding fathers, even folks like Benjamin Franklin, who enslaved human beings and ran advertisements for those enslaved human beings in his newspapers. He profited from the slave trade in countless ways. There were many other founding fathers who did not directly enslave human beings, but they were willing to compromise over the matter, again, just to protect their economic interests, just to protect their wealth. These men, the founding fathers, were willing to look past some of the most atrocious crimes against humanity in world history just because they wanted to advance their own financial and political standing. Just like a lot of Epstein's friends and conspirators today are willing to look past the crimes he was committing for their own personal gain. And you can draw a direct line from the founding fathers to Epstein. And what I mean by that is it's all one sick, disgusting, systematically exploited class system. This is class activity we are getting an inside look at. And the ruling class, which perpetuates and protects and advances this system of exploitation, is the class of Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and the quote-unquote Epstein class today that's being exposed right now. The Epstein class is just the capitalist class. Notice how they all protect each other. That is class consciousness. If only the workers of the USA had the same class consciousness as the capitalists, we would be way better off right now. The ruling class wants us, again, to hold these two conflicting ideas in our head at once. On the one hand, the system that exists today is somehow metaphysically distinct from the system which allowed slavery back in the days of the founding fathers going into the 1860s. But on the other hand, they want us to have this nationalistic identification with this nation going back to the founding fathers. They want us to revere these men who upheld slavery while somehow also thinking of what we have today as distinct from what they had back then. But it's all one system, and it's just developed over time. When slavery was legal all the way until the 1860s in the southern United States where I'm from, the slavery of human women and girls included rampant sexual abuse and exploitation. And this sort of systemic abuse continued long after the abolition of chattel slavery in the wake of the Civil War. It just changed form. As the US moved into a hyper-capitalist industrial era, the mechanism of exploitation of women and girls shifted from ownership to economic entrapment. You see, in the 19th century, in every major city, there were these brothels, and they catered exclusively to robber barons and wealthy elites. And powerful political machines developed in all these different regions, like Tammany Hall in New York City, or like the Good Old Boy Network where I'm from. There was a whole class of ruthless men who were known as cadets, and they specialized in luring young, mostly immigrant women or ethnic minorities into debt bondage, making these cadets some of the pioneers of the modern sex trafficking industry. Throughout the Gilded Age, powerful conspiratorial rings of police and politicians and brothel owners built up a protected racket of human trafficking and systematic exploitation which catered to the ruling class. And even then, in the 1800s and the early 1900s, there were members of the working class who saw this happening and struggled against it, and they were all socialists. I'm talking about people like Lucy Parsons, Emma Goldman, Elizabeth Gurley Reginald, and Wright Kaufman, who documented the ways in which women and girls were forced into sexual servitude for wealthy men through debt traps and other forms of economic coercion. There were countless Epstein-like figures throughout the last 200 years. Men like Stanford White, the wealthy architect of Madison Square Gardens, who lured and drugged young showgirls, most famously Evelyn Nesbit when she was just 16, and Harry Thaw, the heir to a massive Pittsburgh coal and railroad fortune, who ended up murdering Stanford White. And during the murder trial, it was revealed that Thaw himself was also sexually violent and had purchased and abused several women using his fortune to cover up his crimes. Going into the 1920s, the rise of Hollywood and the studio system led to the rampant, wide-scale, and highly normalized sex trafficking and exploitation of women and girls. The story of Hollywood is in many ways the story of the so-called casting couch. And there are simply far too many examples for me to mention of powerful men in Hollywood using their influence and wealth to take advantage of young actresses and models and dancers. Major studios like MGM and Fox and Paramount would employ what they called procurers, like Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling, to assist powerful executives and politicians and other really wealthy, famous members of the ruling class in the exploitation and trafficking and coercion of women and girls, and in cleaning up any resulting fallout, such as abortions and assaults and public scandals. After World War II, as capitalism became global and travel became easier, the procurement industry became an international fixture of the ruling class. And figures like John Casablancas were criticized for creating a system that funneled very young women into the orbits of wealthy older men at international parties through cover businesses, which usually took the form of modeling agencies. And yes, Donald Trump allegedly used modeling agencies to cover up these same kinds of exploitation operations. As public sensitivities began to shift in the mid to late 20th century, in large part thanks to advancements in our social consciousness, which arose during the civil rights movement, which brought more public attention to the plights of women and exploited minorities, wealthy capitalists sought to better conceal their absolutely sick, disgusting activity by moving them away from public hotels and casinos and into private sovereign spaces, such as private yachts and jets and islands. So the ruling class created a sort of shadow world for themselves where laws did not apply and crimes could be safely hidden away from the prying eyes of the media and the paparazzi. And ironically, these mega yachts and private islands and private jets and secluded mansions became the subject of much hype and spectacle through programs like, you guessed it, Lifestyles of the rich and famous. So we were all socially conditioned to think that wealthy people having these private islands where they could do whatever they want was cool through programs like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And that is the world into which Jeffrey Epstein was born. He was hardly the first person to ever offer these sorts of services to billionaires and politicians. He was not the first and only fixer or procurer who catered to the disgusting whims of rich and powerful capitalists. Before any of us ever heard Epstein's name, there was Lawrence King Jr., a high-profile Republican figure and the manager of the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska. By the mid-1980s, King was a rising star in the GOP who was known for his lavish lifestyle of private jets and expensive jewelry and a residence on Washington, D.C.'s Embassy Row. In 1988, the credit union collapsed after federal regulators discovered nearly $40 million had gone missing. King was eventually convicted of massive embezzlement and fraud, and he served 15 years in prison. But during the financial investigation into the scandal, multiple individuals came forward with claims that the stolen money was being used to fund a nationwide child sex trafficking ring. They alleged that King acted as, you guessed it, a procurer, bringing children to parties attended by powerful politicians and business elites in Omaha and Washington, D.C. Many of the accusers were former foster children or residents of the famous Boys Town orphanage in Omaha. Critics and victims at the time argued that King and his associates had utilized the state's foster care and institutional systems to prey on children who lacked family protection and whose disappearances or runaway statuses could be easily dismissed by authorities. This is exactly what Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell did. These are examples of systematic exploitation which has always been perpetrated by the ruling class. Procurers like Epstein and King only are able to operate because of the nature of capitalism and class society. It is capitalism which allows a small fraction of humanity to have way more power and wealth than any individual should have over the rest of us. And honestly, the wealth that capitalists have today, I'm talking about billionaires like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Donald Trump, that wealth, that power far exceeds anything we saw in the feudal world of kings and emperors. These billionaires, corporate CEOs, presidents, the ruling class, they command the authority and the terrible power to buy and sell human beings to prey upon them. And it's capitalism that serves as the economic base that gives them this institutional superstructural power. And of course, under capitalism, the ruling class owns the means of information production. I'm talking about our media, our cultural institutions. And that's why our media is designed to brainwash us with propaganda into believing that the ruling class is awesome, that they're our leaders, that they are our moral examples that we should look up to. And we get convinced to do the work of capitalists for them by glazing them, by defending capitalism for the ruling class. We work against our own class interests. And it's all because, as Marx said, The ideas of every epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. We have to develop our own class consciousness, and that means developing our own social institutions, developing our class conscious ideology among our fellow workers, and teaching one another that Jeffrey Epstein is just a symptom of a much deeper problem. And this problem is class society. This problem is capitalism. In order for a man like Jeffrey Epstein to exist, we have to have a system, an economic system, which is deeply unjust at the very foundation. We have to have a system like capitalism, which allows a small group of billionaires to hypnotize us as the masses into compliance. We are conditioned from the moment we're born to defend and protect this very system. We are conditioned to take the side of our class enemies, of these disgusting sex trafficking that run the world. If you look in the comment section of pretty much any video discussing Jeffrey Epstein, you'll find MAGA cultists in the comments section asking questions like these. Why didn't Joe Biden do anything about the Epstein files? Why didn't Democrats talk more about Epstein before Trump took office? Why don't liberals talk more about the Clintons' relationship with Epstein? Here's the thing. Those are valid-ass questions, and we as progressive members of the working class really need to be open to asking ourselves these kinds of questions. And I know that a lot of my subscribers already realize this, but just in case you're new around here, the fact is the Democratic National Convention, the Democrats, are a bourgeois party. They're a ruling capitalist class controlled party. Republicans and Democrats both exist to serve the ruling class of capitalists. And it's obvious that Epstein's network had deep connections to both the DNC and the GOP. And that's no surprise. They both work for the same class interests, and behind the scenes, they both want the same thing, to advance and protect the interests of the ruling capitalist class, which is why we as workers need to build up our own working class parties and institutions. We need to understand and teach each other that these bourgeois parties are not on our side, and they will never be on our side because they are, by definition, dominated by the wealth of the ruling class. The ruling class uses the Republican-Democrat divide to keep workers at each other's throats. And the Epstein situation makes it incredibly obvious. It is very clear that both Democrats and Republicans were palling around with Epstein. Not just any Republicans and Democrats, but high-ranking prominent officials, presidents, prominent political leaders, and billionaires from the supposed left and right are clearly implicated in the files. But they want us as workers to divide ourselves along these bullshit bourgeois party lines, when they themselves are clearly protecting each other from justice and the truth. Look at how they've come together, and not a single one of these billionaire freaks has come forward to express the truth or to expose their fellow capitalists. And that's because the Epstein class is the capitalist class. And unlike the working class, the capitalist class has class consciousness. Really, it's remarkable. These billionaires, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of them hate each other as individuals, but as a class, they have each other's backs, and not a single one of these powerful men who own the essential means of production of our society has been truthful or upright about the Epstein files or about their relationship to Jeffrey Epstein. They are all complicit, and they are all lockstep, arm in arm, marching forward together to defend each other from the fallout of the Epstein files. And that's because these Epstein files are not really about Jeffrey Epstein and his friends. The Epstein files are interesting only in so much as they offer us a glimpse into the horrendous world of our ruling class. They let us see what capitalism truly is, what these capitalists are truly like. They are an untouchable economic class of oligarchs who are allowed to abuse their power and abuse us as workers without any restraint and without any consequences. The Epstein files lay near the reality of the capitalist system. The Epstein files challenge our perception filters. They glitch them out, and they let us realize on some level that there are two sets of rules in our capitalist class society. There are the rules that we must follow as workers, things like laws, and then there are rules that our oppressors must follow to stay in the good graces of their fellow capitalists. Our founding fathers were a ring of wealthy and powerful human traffickers who exploited children, enslaved human beings sexually exploited girls and women, and they covered up the behavior of their fellow pedophiles like Thomas Jefferson. And if there's one thing the Epstein files show, it's that our ruling class today is exactly the same. And that's because this is just the nature of class society, the nature of capitalism. The only solution is to end class society, to put humanity on equal footing, and to get rid of the oligarchs. And I think a lot of people are coming to that conclusion, but a lot of people don't know what to do. We have analysis paralysis, we feel powerless, and as individuals, we are powerless. So what do? How do we fix this problem? How do we end class society? Step one is to build up class consciousness. We as workers need to understand our historic mission, which is to overthrow capitalism and end class society once and for all. That's not as easy as it sounds in a place like the USA. I recognize that. America's ruling class has had 250 years to indoctrinate us with bourgeois ideology and to make us actively oppose working class consciousness. And over on our Substack and on our Medium, we have an article which goes into more detail about all the ways in which capitalism conditions the working class to not have class consciousness. I hope you'll give that a read if you want to learn more about the ways in which this Epstein class, the capitalist class, keeps the working class pacified and powerless. And if you'd like to take a very deep dive into the philosophical foundation that we use here at NonCompete to analyze and struggle against this deeply unjust society, you can check out these textbooks on dialectical and historical materialism. We offer the ebooks absolutely for free at bannionhouse.org/shop. So if you found this video interesting, I think you will particularly enjoy the chapter on social consciousness in part 2, which really helped me wrap my head around why we as workers still fall for capitalist propaganda all the time, even when it's so goddamn absurd. And this book also outlines the solution, which is, again, building class consciousness. Before we can overthrow these capitalist creeps, we as workers must first come to see capitalism for what it is, which is a system which gives far too much power to the worst kinds of people. Only class struggle and social revolution can bring about an end to this terrible system of oppression and bring about authentically democratic, worker-controlled systems of government. A massive and powerful industry exists to steer us away from class consciousness. And in the weeks and months to come, a lot of people are going to come forward to you on YouTube, on television, all around you. They're going to be preaching to you about the merits of the system of capitalism, which was designed by monsters who enslaved and sexually exploited children and adults. Liberal pundits are going to come forward, and politicians and influencers, and they're going to tell you that this clique of capitalists over here is built different. This faction of this bourgeois political party will put us back on the right track. That Jeffrey Epstein doesn't represent the real America, and they're going to make appeals to your patriotism, and they're going to twist themselves into rhetorical knots to try and lure us all back into the fold and metaphysically distinguish between the Epstein class and the capitalist class. And they're going to make us think, oh, this isn't the system that our wonderful, glorious founding fathers designed. That's bullshit. The founding fathers did this same kind of shit. The Epstein files are not a divergence from Americanism. Epstein does authentically represent the real USA. He is fundamentally cut from the same cloth as Jefferson and Washington. Epstein embodies exactly the same practices and behaviors and worldview which the founding fathers embodied. If anything, the founding fathers practiced their depraved, cruel, twisted crimes against humanity much more openly and on a much more massive scale than Jeffrey Epstein. They intentionally designed a political economic system which gives wealthy oligarchs power, absolute power over other human beings. And the things they did with that power were absolutely revolting. Look, I myself grew up admiring the founding fathers. They were my heroes when I was young. And I knew that they committed atrocities like slavery and genocide, but I was conditioned by the media, by my schooling, by my culture to look past these crimes against humanity. For a long time, my perception filter was very strong. But even back in those days when I looked up to the founding fathers, somewhere deep down, I had cognitive dissonance and it gnawed away at me. I mean, I can remember actively avoiding looking more deeply into these topics. I didn't want to know any more of the truth. And when I finally did allow myself to be confronted by the stark realities of the Founding Fathers and the brutal history of the American Empire, it was a painful process. But now that I'm on the other side of it, I feel liberated and clear-headed. I no longer feel compelled to look past the horrible truth that Benjamin Franklin bought and sold human beings, that Jefferson was a sex trafficker of children, that George Washington starved the human children that he enslaved, and that he bred them like stock animals. Jeffrey Epstein is the legacy of the Founding Fathers. Everything Epstein did, the Founding Fathers did 2.5 centuries ago. That is just the stark, harsh, cold reality, and you'll see that yourself if you can break through your perception filter. As we enter the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, we have a very important choice ahead of us. We can face the truth head on and admit that this system of capitalism that the Founding Fathers developed is the same depraved system that commands our government today. Or we can just look the other way, keep upholding the system, keep running cover for some of the most disgusting men in human history. We've been lied to for 250 years by these people. We have let them run our society for 2.5 centuries. And look at what we've gotten for it. We've got a warmongering, racist police state. What else can I say? I am sick of being lied to. I'm sick of these capitalist freaks making things worse all the time. I'm sick of the war. I'm sick of all of it. Capitalism has run its course, and it's time for us to wake up to the fact there are tried and true methods of overthrowing capitalism. You can find out more in these free ebooks that we have, again, at bandinghouse.org/shop, and maybe check out some of our other videos. We talk about these topics all the time. For now, I'm EJ. This is NonCompete. Thanks so much for watching. Power to the people, workers of the world unite, and all that jazz. We'll see you next time.